this what is happening? The development now of the independent class responses to this crisis?
Yes, I can't say that when I wrote the perspective last week that I had the lecture of 2009 in mind. Thank you. It's always nice to see that something one wrote years ago retains relevance and proves to be accurate. I mean, throughout the year, since the pandemic began, or very short, once it became clear we were dealing with a pandemic, the World Socialist website, the International Committee, began to develop the concept that the pandemic was a trigger event. It was a critical turning point in world history, that it was not just, so to speak, a disease. It was an event which would accelerate and intensify all the vast contradictions that existed within global capitalist society. If I may just back up a bit, because I hope I can come back to this somewhat later, when we speak about the present situation, bear in mind it's 30 years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a period that we were told in 1991 marked the end of history and the triumph of liberal capitalist democracy. Who believes that today? But the concept of a trigger event, I think, has held up very well, because what we are seeing, as in World War I, an event which essentially determined the whole course of the 20th century, was that it brought into focus long developing contradictions in society, which finally produced, in the most explicit terms, a political differentiation across class lines. The party of war, imperialism, the bourgeoisie, was determined to perpetuate and continue that war until they achieved their war aims, which were, of course, bound up with the profit interests of the national bourgeoisie, their global strategic interests. The working class, after a period initially of shock, stunned disbelief, the years, people, when the war began, thought that it would be over by Christmas. Then it persisted into 1915, into 1916, catastrophic casualties, death on a scale that had never been witnessed, battles in which thousands died in a single day. And it went on and on and on. Working in relative isolation, the revolutionary internationalists, who were a very, very small minority within the socialist movement itself, foresaw that within this catastrophe, there would emerge the response of the working class and the tasks of which Lenin took upon himself in particular in declaring war on war. He foresaw that inevitably the war would transform itself into, or would produce its opposite, that the movement for peace would take the form of a revolutionary struggle of the working class against imperialism. In 1917, in January, Lenin spoke of the death-like stillness in Europe, but he said Europe is pregnant with revolution. And how correct he was. What we are now seeing is the pandemic is clearly producing the same sort of social differentiation. There are two basic responses to the pandemic, just as there were two basic responses to World War I. One response says, money above all else. It's unfortunate that so many people are dying, but there is no alternative. Or as Bloomberg said to the teachers of New York, suck it up. Just this weekend, the Wall Street Journal carries an article, and if I could just briefly quote a sentence, in which they're now adopting the view is, let's face it, they say, there will be, this pandemic is going to continue. We may be able to manage it, but it's not going to go away. And they quote one authority as saying, going through the 5 phases of grief, we need to come to the acceptance phase that our lives are not going to be the same, said Thomas Frieden, former director of the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention. I don't think the world has really absorbed the fact that these are long-term changes. In other words, what he's really saying is people will continue to die, as the British Medical Journal warns, and they are correct to call this social murder. People are just going to have to get used to it. When he talks about changes, he's not talking about accepting lower levels of profitability. That's not on their agenda. So we've reached the point where this crisis is assuming a very, very clear political differentiation. The struggle against the pandemic becomes a struggle against this policy of return to work. It becomes a struggle to change society in a manner which allows it to deal with such immense social crises where life is not subordinated to the drive for profit. Life is not subordinated to the geopolitical interests of the ruling elite. The fight against the pandemic is recognized as an international global struggle of the vast majority of mankind, pitted against a ruthless oligarchy in country after country, which seeks to utilize this pandemic and live with this pandemic for its own purposes. So I think, going back to the quote, yes, we are at a point where the social issues and the political issues are being defined in very, very stark class terms. I just want to make one point. I know we'll be coming back to this. Certainly the events of January 6th are a warning, because part of the bourgeois response is to turn ever more openly to fascistic forms of rule. In evaluating the riot, let us keep in mind that this was not just a few thousand people. It had immense institutional support. It had the support of the main, now official opposition party, to which the Democratic Party refers continuously as their colleagues. It had institutional support within the Senate and the House. It had institutional support in the White House itself. Anyone who wants to claim that this is not a staggeringly critical event, there's no previous precedent for such an event. But that is the ruling class response. What is emerging is the working class response, and that's not just a national response, it is an international response. And I think when we look at the situation, the World Socialist website, the International Committee, sees a situation, a world pregnant with revolution. The masses all over the world are coming to grips with this reality, that if the fight against the pandemic is a fight against capitalism. And to come to grips with this pandemic and all the other social problems which confront mankind requires a fundamental transformation of the whole world economic system. Science today means economic planning, global organization, and that can only be achieved through social revolution.